Welcome CSE 121, Programming 1, to our checkerboard exercise. This is 14 for fall 2020, and this is an exercise I designed maybe 2 years ago, spring 19, and instead of just showing you the video from that version, it seems to change every time I do it. And every time I look at the videos, we do something different and we make it more efficient. And that's part of what we're trying to do with programming, is become more efficient every time. And that'll be the same here. This version will be more efficient than probably the one we've done back in 2019. We'll do it with less code. So each time the code's becoming less and less, and that's what we're going to try to do here. Let me just run this so you can see what's going to happen. Again, it's just a checkerboard, and it has 8 rows. So it's 8 across and 8 going up, and they alternate. And each square is 50 pixels. So basically we have 50 times 8, so they're 400 pixels. So this whole thing is a 400 by 400 square that we're working on here. So let's run it, and I'll just show you what happens here. It's really going to run one square first, and then we're going to find ways to run a function and loop it, and then run a row of squares, and then actually loop it again, so we run 4 rows of squares, and then do the same thing again, except just shift it up and over. So it's going to move up and over like 100 pixels. And then at the end, after those rows are done, we're just going to draw a box around it with no fill. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to try to be as efficient as we can with a couple functions here. And we're even going to try to throw in arguments and parameters, which I haven't done in the past, but when I did it again, I realized, well, we could throw in parameters. So we'll try to do that, and we'll try to learn how to be efficient by doing this. So this is 14 checkerboard, and what we're going to do is go to your repels, and go into your CSE 121 folder and make a new repel, and make sure it's Python with turtle, and I'll just call it 14 checkerboard. And I'll put my last name first initial on it, and I'll create repel. And the first thing we'll do is we'll import turtle. And we're not doing any random things here, so we could just import turtle. And we're going to make a turtle, and we'll just call it T, because that's nice and short. So we'll do T equals turtle, and turtle comes up here, so we can click on turtle.turtle from the turtle class. And we're going to give the turtle a attribute of speed. So we'll say t.speed, and we'll make it like 10 for now. We'll even go faster in the end, but that way it'll speed up drawing all these squares when we start doing them. And I don't think we need any other attributes right now. So we're just going to initiate the turtle, or instantiate the turtle, I should say, and then we're going to create a function that draws a square. So let's do that, and we're just going to define a function. We'll just call it draw square. So we're going to draw one square first. We're going to work from the inside out. So we'll draw a square, and we've done this before, so this should be a review of drawing a square. And we're just going to say t.forward, and like I mentioned earlier, we're making our squares 50 in length, so they're going to have 50 on the side. So we're going to do that. It's going to be 50 forward, and then it's going to be 90 degrees when they turn, and that's going to be a left attribute, and we're going to put 90. So we don't have to use any randomness here. And then we're going to loop this. So we're going to put a for loop in here for I in range, and it's going to go 4 times. And we have to make sure we put the colon outside of there, and I'll hit enter so it indents, and I'll make sure I indent this. And we're also going to make a square that fills. So we're going to do a begin fill in front of it, and make sure if you see something that looks odd, like it's just in black like that, it's because it's missing the T here. So put a T here. There we go. And then that's showing kind of purple or pink like a method. And then at the end, I'm going to do the T.endfill. And begin fill and end fill have the underscore. They still have the parentheses. And I'll make sure I unindent this. And that's what we have so far. And I'm going to run it and just see what happens so far. And nothing happens. Why does nothing happen? Because we didn't call it yet. So let's create a call. And it's just going to be draw, and there it is. It comes right up, and we have to put our parentheses. And there's our call for draw square. We'll just see what we're dealing with here. And there's our square. Now, another property we could put on there is hide turtle, because we don't need to see this. So you saw on our checkerboard, we didn't see any turtles there. So we can put that right in. T.hide turtle. I'm putting all my properties out here, and in some cases, we've instantiated the turtle inside a function. Here, we're doing it outside because we may have multiple functions. And if you instantiate a turtle inside one function, it may not be available to another function. It may be local in scope. So by doing it out here, it's going to be global in scope, and that means it's available to all the different functions. It's going to know who T is and who the turtle is. So that's why we're doing just this part out here, and everything else we're going to do inside the function. So let me just try this out again. And there's our square. Now, I'm going to move this down here because what we're actually going to do is we're going to start down here, down at like negative 200, negative 200. Because remember, it goes negative, and then it goes to 0, and then it goes to positive. So it's going to go from negative 200 to positive 200. And same thing from the bottom. It's going to start at negative 200y and go up to 200y. So it's going to start, its bottom corner, this corner here, is going to start at negative 200, negative 200. So when we actually make a function to do that, we can start it there, and we could even put variables in, and eventually what we're going to do is use arguments. But this is the start. And what we're going to do is use this function call inside another function. We're going to call it inside another function. So we're actually going to eventually take this out of here. We're not just going to call it loose out here in the code. We're actually going to call it inside another function. Let's create another function. We're actually going to draw a row of squares. So I'm going to call this draw row. Now, this may end up being rows, so we could just call it draw rows. Let's just do that, since I think that's what it's going to do. So we'll call it draw rows. Now, what's going to happen in here, we are going to have to move it down. So I think what we're going to do here, and it's going to kind of change as well. Remember, because it's one here, but it's going to kind of change. So what I can do is I can put a variable in here. I'll start it this way. I'll say x equals, and I'll put minus 200, and then I'll put y equals minus 200, because that's going to be a starting point when we do a goto. So I'm going to put that in here as a variable. Now we're probably going to change this and put it as arguments eventually, but we could do that so we can understand what's happening here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have to do a goto. And also, because we're going somewhere, remember that whenever you say, hey, go there and do something and start drawing something, it'll make a line. So we typically wrap our gotos around with a pen up, pen down. So I'm going to put t.pen up and then a t.goto, and I'll put in xy because that's going to use the variable that we just set up there. It's a local variable, meaning it's inside the function. And then we'll do a t.pen down. And if we want to do this 4 times, we could actually make it go to this position and then do what? What's it going to do when it goes there? It's going to go to a position, it's going to put its pen down, and what is it going to do? It's going to draw a square. Well, we don't have to put all this stuff in here because we already have it. Basically, when it gets to where it's going to be, we're going to say draw square. So we can put the function call right here, draw square. So we're going to draw the square inside this function. So that means I could get rid of this. I don't need a function call there. As long as it's getting called somewhere. Now we still have to call this function. Right now we still have no function calls. Now because this is inside a defined function, it doesn't mean it's going to get called. It doesn't get called unless this function gets called. Or else it's never going to, it's kind of just sitting in a closet. Think of it that way. It's kind of sitting in a closet. It's not getting used. So until we open this closet up, then we could use this draw square. Now we're going to start it over here at minus 200, and it's going to lift its pen up and go there, and it's going to go to minus 200. It's going to put its pen down, and it's going to do the draw square. Now we want this to happen 4 different times. Remember, we're going to draw 4 in a row down at the bottom. So what we can do is we can put a for loop. We're going to type for I in range, and we're going to do it 4 times. And I'll put my colon here, and I'll hit return. And then all of these have to be indented. Now, let's try this out. Let's put a function call outside of everything. So I have to call this function. Because again, if I ran it right now, nothing happens. Because there's no function call. It doesn't get called inside here. We have to let it out. So I'm going to go here and type draw rows. And put the parentheses. So now we're going to draw rows. It'll execute this function, and it should run this thing 4 times because it's inside a loop. So let's just see what it does. And it doesn't look like it's doing anything. And we can't see it going around, but actually what's happening is it's doing it 4 times right here because we didn't change position. So what we have to do is there's 4 times it's going through here. It's doing 4 iterations. And every time it should actually move over. And it should move over, this is 50, it should not move over 50, it should move over 100, so it kind of jumps to the next spot. Because remember, if this is the starting spot down here, the next starting spot is going to be 50 and 50, it's going to be 100. Because we're just skipping over blocks and letting them white instead of making white blocks. So we're just making black blocks here. and we're going to skip over them and just use the background and leave that white. So it's going to be 100. So we have to move the x over 100 each time. Well, can we do that? Sure. After it draws 1, because this, remember, this is drawing 1. This is drawing 1 square. And we can even put here, draw 1 square. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move it over. So we're going to say x plus or equals, so we're going to increment it 100. So x is going to go over 100. So that means each time through here, it's going to add to it. And that's why we're keeping this outside the loop, because this is kind of just the starting point. Now each time it goes through, it's going to move over. So let's see what happens. Let's see if this works. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4. And that works pretty good. It's moving over 100 each time. It's adding to that. And that's all we need as far as what we're doing, because remember, the white ones are in between and the white ones will be here, so even though we don't see them. So the next row we're going to do is actually going to be here, 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 here. Now, instead of trying to do a loop and saying, oh, go up and over, which is going to be hard to do, what we're going to do is we're going to do all the rows that are the same x as these. That way it's easier to repeat, but we're just going to bump it up like 100. So what we're going to do is we're going to do what we just did and loop it again. It's crazy. We're going to put a for loop in a for loop. So we're going to say for I in range, and it just happens we're doing 4 again because we're doing 4 rows. So I'm going to put 4 here, and I'll put a colon, and I'll hit enter. So now that for loop is inside that for loop. So what we're doing, what we did right here, we're going to do 4 more times inside the function. And I'm going to hit tab. Now, there's different ways to do it. You can call the function 4 times and change some things. But we're going to move this here, and everything is going to happen inside there. So let's see what happens here. Now, again, if it's running this 4 times, it's running this, 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 this. And after it does that, it's going to do it again. So actually, I'm going to put here draw 4 rows, because that's what this loop is going to do. This one is basically drawing 1 row. Okay, so this is drawing 4 rows, this is drawing 1 row, this is drawing 1 square. We have everything in there that's working. Now, if we run this right now, it's going to do that, and look what it's doing. It's basically, and it's good to kind of just run this out and see what's happening. It's actually doing it 4 times, except the x keeps increasing. So wherever it ended up, it keeps going in that direction. So it's just drawing one after the other. It's never changing its y. So let's make sure we change its y, and that means after each loop of this one, after each row, we're going to change the y. So you don't want to put a change in y here, because that means it'll change after it draws each square. This is basically drawing your 4 squares, and it's each iteration it's going through, it's drawing a square. So it's going through. So you don't want the y to change every time it draws a square. You want the y to change every time it's going through the loop of drawing the rows. That's why we're actually going to bump this out. I'm going to go out here, and I'm going to say y plus or equals 100. So it'll go up in that direction. And let's see what happens. So that means here it's going to draw the 4 squares right here. And then once it goes through, once it draws 1 row of 4, then it's going to adjust the y, and then it's going to go up, and it's going to draw it again. Now let's see what happens. This isn't going to work completely yet either, but watch what happens. There's our 1 row, there's 4, and there it goes for the second, except what it's doing, it's continuing out that way. It's kind of making stair steps, because it's never coming back to the beginning. The x is never going back. Once we increment the x to 100, it's staying at that value. We reassign the x, and now it's here, it's 100 over, it's 100 over, it's going 100 each time, so it keeps moving over every time, and what we have to do is actually move it back. So before it actually starts, we have to move it back. So what we could do, let's see if we could do this. So before it goes up for the y, we're actually going to take the x. There's 2 things you could do here. One is you could just redefine x and say x equals negative 200. That means it'll pull it right back here. That means after it draws the 1 row here of the 4 squares, it's going to go back to negative 200. And I'll put this back here. And it'll go back here, and then it'll move up. So let's just see what happens here. So again, we're telling the x to go back here to negative 200. And let's run this. And that actually works. And there's our 4 rows. So here's the next step of this. You could just copy this and make one called Draw Rows 2. I actually did that. I actually did this. And you could do this. You can copy this, and I'll put it after here, and call it Draw Rows 2 or Draw Rows Alternate, whatever you want to call it. It's just a different one. You could copy this and call it Draw Rows 2. You put the function call in here, Draw Rows 2, and think about it. What changes with these? Well, it goes back to 200, or does it? No, it doesn't. This one's going to go back. Let's see where it is. If this is negative 200, if it starts here, this is going to be negative 150. It'll start here at negative 150. I'm talking about the x. So instead of negative 200, it's going to start right here. It's going to be negative 150. So this would be negative 150. And the y, I think, is still going to do the same thing. The y, when it goes through here, the y is still going to have to go up each time, except it's going to start here. So what's also different about the start? Well, the start is going to be negative 150. Because remember, we're starting, the x is going to start here at negative 150. So let's make this one negative 150. And the y is going to start at negative 150. This is, remember, going down. If this is negative 200 going down, coming up, this is negative 150. So this would be negative 150. So we have a second function here, and we're doing a second function call, and we're going to run this. And here's where the second function should come in, and there it goes, and it looks like it's working okay. And there's the last row. Okay, so that's working. So that works. You could essentially end here. One more thing we're going to do, and then we're going to go back and make this more efficient so we don't have 2 functions, because we're just duplicating a function and making changes, and you might think, wow, well, couldn't we do that with arguments? And actually, yes, we can. So we're going to take this from 39 lines of code. Well, it's going to be more because we're going to do one more function. We're going to draw our function that draws a box around here, and this will be pretty easy. We'll just say def draw box. And we could even copy some of this here, this stuff. Let me copy the stuff from the square. Now, we're not going to have a begin fill and end fill, so why even copy that? So I'm going to copy this, because that's basically drawing a square. So let's go in here and let's paste that. And basically, we're drawing one big square. And remember, this is drawing a square. It's drawing 4 sides. So I should put here 4 sides of square. You should know what each loop is doing. It's drawing 4 sides of a square. And it's going to go forward, not 50, but let's see, 50, 100, 200, 300, 400. It's going 400 each time. So it's going 400 each time. It's still doing the left 90. And that's about all it should do, I think, other than we have to start it down at the bottom. So we still have to do a go-to at the bottom. So before we do anything here, we could copy this stuff. Because we're going to do pen up, pen down. Because when it goes to its spot, we don't want to see the line, and then it's going to do its thing, and then go around. But we want its pen down, because that's what's going to make the box. We need the pen down for that. So I'm going to go in here and paste this in here. Now I got to match these things up. These will not be in a loop. They'll just be part of the function, and it's going to be pen up. It's going to go to. Now I can't use xy because this is defined inside a function. This is an example of this is local in here. And if I did this, actually, I'll leave it in here just to show you that I can't borrow xy from here because I'm in a completely different function. I'm kind of like walled off. It's got like a firewall between it. They don't share them. If they're outside of here, they could share them, like these. T is being shared, but I can't share x and y because it's defined inside that function. It's of a local scope to that particular function. So if I put xy in here, it's not going to know what xy is. And maybe I'll leave it in there just so you can see what I'm talking about. But really, it's going to be negative 200, negative 200. That's what it's going to be. But let me just show you what happens here first. If I leave xy in there, I'll just run it just so you can see what happens. Now, it is going to go through the code and execute the code that it can execute until it gets to this final function. Now watch what happens here. Now here's where it's going to get to the point after this last square here. Do we get an error? Oh, I was expecting an error. Now it didn't do anything because doesn't know what xy is. Usually we should get an error. I thought we were going to get an error here. Oh, I didn't call the function. That's why it didn't even get to the error, because I didn't call this function. That's one reason I didn't call the function. So we have to call the function drawBox, and that's why we didn't get an error, because it just ignored it completely. So it didn't even get to this code. But let me do this, and let me make the speed 0, because I think this will make it go a lot faster. I'll put it at 0. And now we have the drawBox function call, and when it gets to this part of the function, it should give us an error at 43, because it's local in scope, and it shouldn't be able to use xy at all. Let's see what happens. Look at that. There's the first ones. There's the second function. Here comes the third function. Error. Line 43. Look at that, just as I predicted. So x is not defined. So when it got here, it didn't know what x is because it doesn't get it from here. It's not pulling anything from any other functions. So what we'd really have to do is just put it in absolute. We'd have to put in -200, comma, -200. And I'll run it. And there it is. So that works. So everything's working here as it should. Now what we're going to do in part 2 is try and see if we can make this work in one function and just use arguments and parameters. Now you may be confused enough just by looking at this, but hopefully you see what's happening here. And we can even, maybe make a red background or something in part 2. But for part 2, I want you to start thinking about it. Actually, as like a challenge, think about how can you make just one function draw not only these rows, but those rows. So try to think about it. I'm going to have a video on it, which I'll go through it, but think of it for yourself. Maybe make a different copy here, put a 2 after it, and see if you could do that. I think I'm going to do that too for part 2. So I'll put a 2 after it, and we'll try to do the one that has arguments and parameters and see if you could send something along. Now, obviously, we're talking about sending along x and y's and things like that, because that's the only thing changing is the position. So if we could send along things that changes the position and just run one function, we'd still have to run 2 function calls, I believe, because they're going to have different locations. But that way we can send arguments and tell them where to start, and that should help it, because that's all we're doing here. These are really just, these variables are kind of like arguments. So look at them. They're the arguments right here. So as long as these things can be, their changes are basically can be used together, that should be okay. We should be able to use these together. So let's see what happens here in part 2. In part 2, we're going to try to use some arguments and parameters. See if you can do that. See if you can make one function that draws all the rows. We'll still have to make this its own function here, and we'll just leave this as it is. I think that's fine. So we'll see in part 2. Try to do that in the meantime. And even make another copy of this, fork it so it has a 2 after it or 1 after it, whatever it is. And then we'll come back in part 2 and we'll try to use some arguments and parameters.